As the United States neared the year of 1860, there were two possible directions for those opposed to slavery. One was the established abolitionist movement, led by the newspaperman William Lloyd Garrison for the previous 30 years. They were very passionate about bringing an end to slavery, but they were also pacifists. Dissatisfied with the electoral compromises of Abraham Lincoln, who in the late 1850s only wanted to restrict slavery to where it currently existed, but not to get rid of it there. In fact, at the time, Lincoln was even open to the idea of purchasing slaves and repatriating them back to Africa as a solution to the race question. The abolitionists' focus was moral persuasion and legal reform. They were the evolutionists on that issue. On the other side was a man named John Brown. John Brown said, this is a quote, "These men are all talk. What we need is action." He first received national attention when he moved to Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas period of the mid-1850s, where he fought with and even killed many pro-slavery settlers who had moved there in order to vote for this territory to become a slave state rather than a free state. And then in 1859, he planned a raid on an arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a slave rebellion that would purge the land of the sin of slavery in blood and in fire. Brown's rebellion did not succeed. In fact, in one of those odd circumstances of history, the American Army unit that put down the rebellion was led by a colonel named Robert E. Lee. But the events at Harper's Ferry led to great tension between the North and the South, and those tensions eventually exploded. First in the election of 1860, which was bitterly contested, which Lincoln won without even appearing on the ballot in several southern states, and ultimately in the bloody Civil War of America that killed hundreds of thousands because they were all Americans who died. And it radically transformed the nation. Now, was it evolution and Lincoln's gradual change, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation after 2 years of war in 1863? And by the way, that Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the states in rebellion, not to the border states that sided with the Union. And so slaves in Kentucky and Maryland were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And then it was only years later, with the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, that slavery was really ended and the evolution, the gradual evolution, won the day. Or was it really a revolution of blood and fire, of the hot Civil War? And the echoes of that Civil War we still hear from then forward, after the failures of Reconstruction and the violent imposition of the Jim Crow South in the 1860s and 70s, the shortfalls of the civil rights movement in our century of the 1960s and 70s in the last 60 years, and even our demands today for systemic change to address systemic racism. Which is the solution? Evolution or revolution? Gradual change or radical revision? You can think of parallels from the Jewish experience, of course. We've experienced drastic change in Jewish life from the days of the Bible when it was written all the way through modern times. Sometimes revolution is imposed on you by historical events. For example, when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed around the year 70 of the Common Era, that required a radical change in Jewish life. The end of animal sacrifices, a shift to a rabbinic Judaism of study and prayer rather than animal sacrifice, a new set of clergy who were determined by education and by teaching and training the rabbis that replaced a clergy of pedigree who were the priests. And this revolution of the destruction of the temple and the beginning of rabbinic Judaism also led to an increasing global dispersion that began before as a kind of gradual evolution of gradual migration, but was now accelerated into the diaspora revolution. 2 millennia later, the modern movement of Zionism was a revolution against the diaspora, and not only a revolution against geography or against politics to reassert Jewish political independence, but also a revolution in Jewish identity, to say we are not primarily a religion, we are in fact primarily a people. Even now, questions of the future of Zionism and the path forward for Zionism continue to be debated on the evolution or revolution front. In 1948, when a partition plan was proposed, some in the Zionist movement said no, all or nothing, and others accepted a partial state at the time. Sometimes we face a choice in Jewish life: how much to change our demands, our desires, our hopes in response to the modern world and in response to new beliefs, and how much to keep the same. In some ways, you could draw a similar parallel of evolution or revolution in the differing responses of Reconstructionist Judaism, founded by Mordechai Kaplan in the 1930s, and Humanistic Judaism, founded by Sherwin Wine and Daniel Friedman in the 1960s. Both movements and their founding ideologies did not believe in traditional theology as it was reflected in the traditional prayer book. They did not believe in a personal God who was a king who commanded people to do things. But the question was, what is the best response to this tradition that we no longer believe in? Is it an evolution, keeping as much as possible to maintain a continuity with the past, and evolving the experience of the service through interpretation and through commentary and through creative translation and some editing of the text, but keeping it largely collected? Now, that was the Reconstructionist response. That was the evolutionist response. And even that was too radical for some traditionalist Jews. In the 1940s, Mordechai Kaplan himself was excommunicated by traditionalist rabbis who said, "You've gone too far. This is a revolution we will not support," even though Kaplan's was rather a gradual evolution. By the 1960s, when Humanistic Judaism was founded, the change went more radically. We made changes to both the content of a ritual service, but also the format. We were willing to rewrite texts, change Oseh Shalom, he will make peace, to Na'aseh Shalom, we will make peace. If that's what we meant, then that's what we would say in whatever language we were saying or singing those words. We chose to say clearly what we believed and what we meant, not through interpretation or through commentary, but through the real words in every language. In the end, we each made different choices. The Reconstructionists, with this evolutionist response, prized continuity more. And humanistic Jews, while we valued some connection to the past, ultimately valued integrity and clear expression of our beliefs over the continuity with the past. We each made choices and values. The Reconstructionists changed some things for values and integrity, and we kept some things for continuity. But in the long run, we had to make choices which way to go, evolution or revolution. For some people, the changes we've made in Humanistic Judaism are too revolutionary, too radical, too much of a break with the past. And for others, it's just right. There are many other examples, of course, through Jewish and human history of that tension between radical change through revolution and incremental change through gradual process and progress. Is someone a terrorist or are they a freedom fighter? Should we follow the nonviolent example of Martin Luther King Jr. or the punch back if you punch me example of Malcolm X? Although we should note that Martin Luther King Jr. was actually both more radical than we remember today and was more hated in his day than we remember today either. Or in contemporary politics, it's either Clinton or Bernie or Biden or Bernie, depending on which election you want to relive. As with most choices, there is some truth on both sides. There are pluses and minuses to both evolution and to revolution. I have to say at the outset, my temperament is much more inclined toward moderate change, but I'm willing to accept that there is a time and a place and a purpose for both. And so in the spirit of enlightenment and evaluating the evidence, let's take a look at some of the pluses and minuses to both revolution and to evolution. The pluses to revolution? Well, what's that old saying? You see it protests all the time. What do we want? Whatever the agenda is. When do we want it? Now. It's not What do we want? A somewhat better situation. When do we want it? Well, whenever we get around to passing the law. It's not a gradual process. People want change now, especially if it's a change they desire immediately, or that they think is a crisis, or that needs addressing now, or that should have been addressed a long time ago. Asking people to be patient sometimes is painful for them. There's also the advantage, the attraction of envisioning starting with a clean slate. You know, when you're trying to improve a building, you could simply add to the existing building or try to renovate it or change a room here or there or redecorate something. But sometimes the best building will be the one where you demolish the old building and start from scratch. And you can build it gold LEED certified, and you can build it environmentally focused, and you can build it exactly the way you need to use it for you and not just accommodating what was there before. You think about all the possibilities with that blank slate. Sometimes when we're in the congregational world and we're thinking about what can we do differently, we have to go through a thought exercise and envision, if we were starting this congregation from scratch, what would we have done about Shabbat celebrations? What would we have done with charging dues or not charging dues, or having a variety of options for supporting the congregation? We have to sometimes start from scratch. We need a revolution because simply evolving might not do it well enough. We need to start from a clean slate, and it's attractive too. And the third advantage to revolution is that sometimes it makes the more moderate change seem more palatable. What you wind up doing is you shift what's now called the Overton window. I'll actually have a graphic version of this so you can see. The idea of the Overton window is the acceptable range of discourse on a particular issue. And this is another chart another thinker has put together to demonstrate the spectrum here. So on either end of the political spectrum, the far ends are unthinkable, and then radical, and then it becomes acceptable when it hits that Overton window. And in fact, the closer you get to what becomes policy, becomes sensible, it's even popular, and ultimately it becomes the law and the way things run. Of course, the challenge is you want to shift that window in your direction so that what used to be acceptable, but barely, now becomes popular and even policy. Or even what used to be radical can become sensible. You move that window and you make it more likely to have change in your direction. So sometimes the moderates need the revolutionaries to move that window of what's possible and what can be done. Now, there are downsides to revolution, of course. Often you have revolution at stage 1 and guillotines at stage 2. You know, it's the dangers of utopianism. If you imagine we can start from scratch, we can make a perfect society, a perfect program. Well, anything that gets in the way of the perfect is expendable. It's justifiable to destroy it. That's why so much terrible loss of life and suffering was imposed in the Soviet Revolution, in the Maoist Chinese Communist Great Leap Forward, because the goal was perfect society. And so if a little person has to suffer here and there for the perfect society, then suffer they certainly will. The other challenge, of course, is that the revolutions leading to guillotines can mean that there are often unintended consequences. You know, you had the French Revolution dedicated to liberté, égalité, fraternité, and then you have the reign of terror under Maximilien Robespierre, and then Robespierre himself falls under the guillotine. And ultimately, the revolution itself falls to the dictatorship, the Emperor Napoleon. Or even in the 20th century, the Iranian Revolution initially had broad support. It was not only the religious fundamentalists who were behind it, but the Iranian middle class, the bourgeoisie, were ultimately co-opted and turned aside by the Ayatollahs, who have now imposed the Islamic government we see in Iran for the last 50 years. The other challenge to having an attitude of revolution is that there's a very slight difference between righteous and self-righteous. Someone who's righteous is working for something good. But as you do that and you're working for the perfect good that will wipe away anything that gets in the way, it's very easy to become self-righteous. And that means you lack humility because you know you're right. You lack any doubt because you're positive that yours is the best answer. There's no room for other opinions. There's no ability to persuade anyone. You simply shame and browbeat them into following the revolution because otherwise they're part of the problem. I saw a Facebook dialogue the other day. Someone was talking about how the initial executive orders that President Biden has put in place are so positive. And to every subthread, the same person posted the same set of comments, cut and pasted, that said, Biden is part of the fascist, capitalist, colonialist enterprise that's never going to change anything. And yet, it was not persuasive. It was noise, because it was the same thing over and over again with no attempt to persuade. It was simply repeating the dogma. And that's the risk to revolution. You lose sight of reality and boots on the ground and the need for the people to follow you. You know, it's like you're the one man running ahead and the army is not behind you. So let's turn to evolution and look at the positives and the negatives. Certainly, we understand that there is a natural human fear of change, fear of the unknown. And so an evolutionary change perhaps lets us feel more comfortable putting our toe in the pool instead of diving in the deep end. We also know that there are often vested interests in the status quo. We have assets, we have retirement accounts, we have jobs, we have professions, we have routines, we have what we come to expect, and changing that can be challenging, in part because we don't know where we're going and we're not sure it's going to work. This is what's sometimes called the innovator's dilemma, where you have a current product that works, but do you risk that market, that product, by creating something new that may or may not work? In the end, you wind up keeping the same old thing and making incremental changes instead of trying something radically new. So you make a better flip phone as opposed to a smartphone. There's also that fear of the undiscovered country, as in Hamlet's words, that makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. In democracy, of course, you need to convince people. You need to bring them along, not just impose a solution from a technocrat. And tangible progress, the evolution approach, can make a real difference. Those positive changes can be very important for certain people. Think about the criminal justice reform that just passed in Illinois. It's not prison abolition, but it will absolutely improve people's lives. Think about the growth of the Black middle class in the aftermath of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. Is there still disparity in wealth, home ownership, income levels, assets, representation on Fortune 500 boards? Absolutely. But is there less of a gap than there was before? That is also true. In the spring of 2020, a 10-year study was done on the effects of the Affordable Care Act. It was not Medicare for all. There was no public option when it was passed in 2010, but it did improve the situation of the uninsured, which fell from 12.5% to about 8%, and the percent insured rose from 72% to 80% who had full health insurance. Back in 2010, bankruptcies used to be twice as likely for those with intermittent healthcare coverage, and now the studies show there really is no difference between the two, and that is very important. Now, there are, of course, downsides to the incremental change as well. If you accept a half a loaf when you're starving, that may not be enough. You might need more than what compromise will get you. There's a rabbinic debate, actually, imagining a scenario with two people lost in the desert, and they're both dying of thirst. They find a water bottle, but in that water bottle is only enough water to save one person. So the question is, should they each share it, which might kill them both? Or does one of them drink it, and then how do you decide which one of them gets to drink it? Interesting questions. It's sort of like the trolley question before they invented the trolley. You know, this is the kind of debate you might have in the theoretical. But the reality is that sometimes in real life, half measures may not do it. It may even be worse than doing nothing. And you need something more radical than incremental change. Sometimes Band-Aids simply address the symptoms, but not the causes. You know, you can give someone your leftover food coming out of the restaurant once a week, but is that the long-term solution to their situation of being homeless or of being hungry? Maybe not. Sometimes that incremental change is a Band-Aid, but not a cure. And finally, there's a wonderful phrase also used in protests: justice delayed is justice denied. If you've ever read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, It's a very powerful passage where he talks about his disappointment in the white moderate, who says, I believe in your cause, but not your methods. You're too loud. You're too disruptive. And he says, well, it's no skin off your back if I'm more patient and wait longer. I'm the one that's suffering now with the injustice now. And so sometimes we who might be inclined toward the moderate are telling the radicals to calm down, to quiet down, to slow down, because that's for our comfort at the expense of their suffering. And sometimes maybe their suffering takes precedence over our comfort. Now, there's no one right answer to the question of evolution or revolution, even as some people are always ready for a revolution and others will only accept gradual evolutionary change if they accept any change at all. But there is really a place for both. Some years ago, the head of American Atheists, which is a very activist and radical humanist secular organization, described his organization as the Marines of the free thought movement. They're going to go on Fox News and yell at people, and they're going to go file a lawsuit against everybody and their brother who does anything remotely threatening the separation of church and state. In fact, they were the ones that were bold enough to sue a small city in Florida that decided to create a Holocaust memorial with a Jewish star on it. How dare they? I tried to explain to them the Jewish star is not primarily or only a religious symbol. It's not the same as a cross. And the persecution of the Holocaust was not a religious persecution. But they didn't want to hear it because their response to every issue was fight, 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 because they're Marines, Marines, Marines. I realized that there are times you need the Marines. There are times that's the proper response. But there are also times when you need diplomats. And if you send in Marines when you need the diplomats, it's not going to work. Now, if you send in diplomats when you need Marines, that's not going to work either. Sometimes we need revolution and sometimes we need evolution, and sometimes we need both to work together. Ideally, we take the strong points of both. A bold vision for the future, but responding to reality and encouraging others to join us as workably and effectively as possible. We have to be willing to blow it all up if it's not working.
Who has said, as part of official defense, like,
1 second.
Donald Trump told me I could do this. Donald Trump invited me.
There are times that we need both, but we have to take the strengths of both. We have to be willing sometimes to blow up the status quo if it's not working. And there are times that we have to demand thorough change and to find common ground as well. We have to accept less than we want sometimes for some of what we need and to be able to tell the difference. And so as a final thought, I want to share one last passage written by a Jewish revolutionary about 50 years ago. It's one we use occasionally in our services as well. Creativity. Old rituals are comforting because they are familiar and predictable. They are safe and secure. They relieve us of the pain of continuous surprise. They reflect the mood of stability and eternity. Old rituals help us relax because they require no more exertion than the effort of repetition. Life without imagination is dull. People without imagination are boring. Imitation and conformity are necessary for survival, but they need to be challenged if life is to go beyond survival, if life is to yield the excitement of happiness. Creative people are vital people. They refuse to accept the world as fixed. They refuse to believe that life offers only one script for living. They see old things and imagine new ways of putting them together. They see new things and fancy old settings which they will transform. They gaze at one scene and envision 100 ways to describe it. They experience one life and imagine 1,000 ways to live it.